The people who first settled Madagascar, an island off the coast of Africa, spoke a language born in Southeast Asia. Not a borrowed word, not a trade influence, the language itself. Madagascar and New Zealand sit around 7,000 miles apart, in different oceans, different hemispheres, different worlds, far enough that a canoe crossing between them would spend weeks without sight of land. Hawaii sits thousands of miles from either one, at the far northern end of the same Pacific. There was no reason for these places to be connected. But the people who first settled all three navigated by the same stars, spoke variations of the same language, and descended from the same ancestors. This is not a theory. This is population genetics, a 2012 study in Proceedings of the Royal Society B that traced Malagasy mitochondrial DNA directly back to island Southeast Asia. This is historical linguistics, Robert Blust's decades of research reconstructing the Austronesian language family tree. And this is experimental archaeology, Ben Finney's Hokulea Voyages, which demonstrated that ancient wayfinding without a single instrument could cross the open Pacific. 3 separate disciplines, 1 origin. So yes, the same ancestors really did reach Hawaii, Madagascar, and New Zealand, and this map will show you how. Most people assume island settlement happened by accident. Canoes blown off course, castaways who got lucky. That's half right, and the half that's wrong is the half nobody tells you. Across the Pacific, this was deliberate, repeated generational seafaring. Across the Indian Ocean, the leading study argues the opposite, and what it proposes instead is stranger than any of it. Along the way, you'll see the ocean crossing that left no margin for error, the founding population Madagascar was really built from, and one word for I that traveled thousands of miles and 1,000 years without ever being written down, and somehow arrived almost unchanged. Start with the ocean itself. The crossing between Borneo and Madagascar is thousands of miles of open water, cutting directly across the Indian Ocean, riding the northeast monsoon, the seasonal wind system that runs east to west from roughly November to March, and the south equatorial current underneath it. A current that flows west across the whole ocean and runs straight into Madagascar's east coast. Winds and water that made the crossing possible, but only for a canoe launched in the right months, on the right heading, with no way to correct course if the timing was wrong. There were no instruments, no compass, no sextant, nothing metal or mechanical at all. What these voyagers had was wayfinding, reading the position of stars, the direction and rhythm of ocean swells, wind patterns, and the flight paths of birds returning to land, and using all of it together to hold a course across open ocean for weeks at a time, out of sight of anything solid. Put that distance in terms you can feel. It is an open water crossing on the scale of the Atlantic Passage from Europe to the Caribbean, one that Europe itself would not attempt for the better part of a millennium. Now take away the coastline, the maps, the metal, and the option to turn back. For decades, this was treated by some as too implausible to be literal. Surely, the thinking went, this had to be accidental, boats blown off course by storms and lucky enough to hit land. That assumption held until Ben Finney's Polynesian Voyaging Society built Hokulea, a reconstructed double-hulled voyaging canoe, and master navigator Maupiai Lug sailed it across the Pacific using only traditional wayfinding techniques. No modern instruments allowed. It worked, repeatedly. It demonstrated, physically and experimentally, that these routes were not accidents. They were achievable, repeatable, learnable skill. Think about what that means in human terms. Crossing an ocean the way you might cross a familiar neighborhood at night, using only what your senses and memory told you about where you were. No margin for error. No way to radio for help. And they didn't just do it once. This same skill carried people from Taiwan through the Philippines and Indonesia roughly 5,000 years ago, then outward across the Pacific to Hawaii, and eventually as far as New Zealand. This isn't a story about one lucky voyage. It's a story about a navigational tradition, precise enough to be trusted with human lives, generation after generation, across nearly half the Earth's circumference. That explains how the crossing was possible. It doesn't explain who actually made it. And the number is smaller than the ocean is wide. Picture a wedding or a village gathering, maybe 30 people in a room. That's roughly the size of the founding group of Asian women whose maternal line runs through the Malagasy nation today. Not 30,000, not 3,000. Around 30 women, according to the 2012 mitochondrial DNA study published in Proceedings of the Royal Society B, and led by researcher Murray Cox, which traced the genetic lineage of Madagascar's population back to a founding group this small. Madagascar today has a population in the tens of millions. A group small enough to fit in a single room became, over roughly 1,000 years, half the ancestry of an entire nation, with its own language, its own culture, its own identity, separated by an ocean and a continent from the ancestors who founded it. This matters because it reframes what colonization even means. We're used to thinking of the settling of distant lands as something empires do, with fleets, with armies, with centuries of institutional momentum behind them. This wasn't that. This was a number of people you could count on your fingers and toes, twice, who became one of the two roots of a nation, the half that came from the other side of an ocean. It's not a story about a large civilization spreading outward. It's a story about how little it actually takes for a seafaring identity to take root somewhere entirely new and outlast everything that comes after it. The other route is African, arriving across the Mozambique Channel, and the Malagasy people today carry both. This video is about one half of that story, the half that had to cross an entire ocean to get there. That explains who arrived and how. But it does not explain how something this fragile, a spoken language, nothing written down, survived 1,000 years and thousands of miles without ever being lost. Say the word I out loud in Tagalog, and you get mata. Say it in Malagasy, on an island off the coast of Africa, and you get maso. Say it in Hawaiian, in the middle of the Pacific, and you get maka. 3 words, half a world apart, and they all trace back to the same root in the Proto-Austronesian language family, the linguistic ancestor that Robert Blust's Out of Taiwan hypothesis identifies as the origin point for this entire language tree. This isn't a coincidence of sound. It's what linguists call a cognate, a word that didn't arise independently in each place, but was carried there, generation after generation, by speakers who never wrote it down. There was no printing press preserving mata in the Philippines while it drifted into maso on Madagascar. There was no dictionary standardizing pronunciation across an ocean. It survived the only way a spoken language can survive across that kind of distance in time, passed from a parent to a child, thousands of times in a row, without the chain ever breaking. And it isn't one word. Malagasy sat beside African languages for more than 1,000 years, and fewer than 1 word in 10 came across. The rest of the vocabulary is still Austronesian, right down to the words for body parts and numbers, the things a person names first and abandons last. A language can borrow trade terms from anywhere. It doesn't borrow the word for I from an ocean away. That layer of a language only travels one way, with the people who speak it. This matters because it means the connection between these islands isn't just something scientists dug up in a lab. It's something that was, in a sense, still being spoken the whole time, hiding in plain sight, in ordinary conversation, in words for the most basic parts of the human body. It's not a relic, it's not a fossil. It's a living fingerprint of a single people who never stopped being connected, even when the land under their feet was separated by entire oceans. That explains the words. But words can theoretically travel through contact, trade, borrowing. A skeptic could argue language alone doesn't prove common ancestry. What closes that argument for good is something words can't fake: the biology itself. Because in 2012, researcher Murray Cox and colleagues published a study in Proceedings of the Royal Society B that looked directly at mitochondrial DNA, the genetic material passed down the maternal line, in the population of Madagascar. When they traced its origin, it led not to Africa, not to the Middle East, but directly back to island Southeast Asia. This wasn't inferred from language or culture or oral tradition. This was written into the biology of the people living on Madagascar today, carried in their cells generation after generation since the original founding population arrived. And the maternal line is only one thread. Whole genome sequencing has since replaced single lineage studies, and the pattern held, an Austronesian dispersal out of Taiwan reaching back roughly 5,000 years. Ancient DNA published in Science went further still, sequencing 164 individuals who lived and died across the Pacific Islands. Not living descendants, but people from the period itself. Different methods, different samples, different parts of the genome. None of them needed the others to be right. They arrived at the same map anyway. Two completely independent lines of evidence, one linguistic, one genetic, pointing to the exact same origin, without either one depending on the other to be true. That's not a coincidence. That's confirmation. This isn't a case of piecing together a plausible story from fragments. It's a case where the words in people's mouths and the DNA in their cells are telling the same story, from two directions that never had to agree. This is a lot to hold at once, a linguistic root word and a genetic marker, both independently pointing to the same origin thousands of miles and 1,000 years apart. There's a version of this map with every study, every date, and every disputed claim laid out side by side. It's the thing I wish existed when I started digging. Subscribe and you'll get it when it's ready. That explains who arrived, and it explains what they carried with them. But it still doesn't explain the strangest part of this whole story. Why these voyagers, capable of crossing open ocean with nothing but stars and swells, chose Madagascar, a landmass sitting almost directly beside Africa, while passing a whole chain of islands that would have been a far shorter, far safer journey. Look at a map of the Indian Ocean, and the paradox jumps out immediately. Madagascar sits close enough to Africa that the idea of it being settled by people from the other side of the ocean feels almost absurd. Between Borneo and Madagascar lies a chain of islands. The Maldives, the Chagos, the Seychelles. Closer, easier, safer landings. And yet the genetic and linguistic evidence doesn't point to any of them as the origin. It points across the entire Indian Ocean to Borneo. This is where the ocean route and the founding population collide into something stranger than either fact alone, because Cox's own paper says something most retellings leave out. His team didn't conclude that Madagascar was a planned colonization. They concluded close to the opposite, that the island was settled by a very small group, around 30 women, most of Indonesian descent, in what may have been a single transoceanic crossing that was never meant to happen at all. So the paradox answers itself, and the answer is worse than the question. Madagascar may not have been chosen over the closer islands. Madagascar may be where the ocean put them. Not a fleet, not an expedition. Possibly one canoe, carrying a few dozen people who never saw home again, and whose descendants number in the tens of millions today. And that doesn't weaken the story, because the Pacific side is proven. Pialug sailed it. From Taiwan through the Philippines and Indonesia 5,000 years ago, out to Hawaii, eventually to New Zealand, reaching distant, specific destinations while bypassing closer ones over and over. That pattern isn't luck. The same seafaring people then may have crossed one ocean on purpose and the other by accident. Both times, they founded a nation. Skill explains the Pacific. Nothing explains Madagascar except how far these people could survive being carried. That explains the where. What's still unresolved is the when, and here, the researchers themselves don't fully agree. Depending on which study you look at, the settlement of Madagascar is dated anywhere from around 500 AD to as late as 800 AD, a gap of roughly 300 years. 300 years is about 10 generations. The distance between you and an ancestor whose name you almost certainly don't know. Cox's own model sits at the late end of that range, closer to 1,200 years ago. It's worth being precise about where these numbers come from. They are estimates built from genetics and language, not from anything dug out of the ground, and the firm archaeological evidence on Madagascar is later again. The disciplines don't just disagree with each other, they are measuring different things. That's not a flaw in the story. It's a feature of how little direct physical evidence survives from a people who left behind no written records, no monuments, no inscriptions marking the date they arrived. This matters because it's a reminder of exactly what this entire video has been reconstructing from indirect evidence. DNA passed down through mothers, Words passed down through speech, wind and star patterns passed down through memory, and canoe routes proven possible only by rebuilding one and sailing it. Nothing was written down. Everything had to survive some other way. And when researchers disagree by 300 years, it isn't because the migration didn't happen. It's because the people who made it happen never needed a written record to know who they were. But they did leave one record behind. It isn't written, and it isn't buried. It's still being spoken. Which brings this back to something planted at the beginning of this video, a word for I. Mata in the Philippines, Maso in Madagascar, Maka in Hawaii. No inscriptions, no shared writing system ever connecting these places. And still, that word crossed an ocean, crossed 1,000 years, and arrived on the other side barely changed at all. So here's what that word actually means, now that you have the full picture. Mata, Maso, Maka. It didn't survive by accident, and it didn't survive because it was written down anywhere. It survived because it was carried, spoken, taught, repeated by people who trusted memory and each other across generations, the same way they trusted stars and swells to carry them across oceans no one else dared cross. The word made it because the people made it. This isn't about migration routes or DNA. It's about an Austronesian identity, the one Filipinos were born into, that existed long before anyone drew a border around those islands or gave them a name. An identity never contained by geography, one that covered distances no empire of its era could match, without ships of iron, without written maps, without armies. Just people, canoes, and the ocean itself as a road. While the rest of the world was still hugging coastlines, these navigators had already touched 3 corners of the earth: Madagascar, Hawaii, New Zealand. Carried there by nothing but stars, swells, and the memory held in their own language. If this changed how you see where Filipino history actually begins, share it with someone who needs to hear it. The next video asks a harder question. If the ocean was never a barrier, what else did these ancestors carry with them that we've never been taught to look for? It's on screen now.